Now we're going to jump immediately into 2D tracking basics. So for this tutorial, we're going to jump over to the tracker room up at the top here. And you see that we are greeted with a lot of buttons on the left, but we're not going to be going through everything. I'm just going to run through the most basic stuff that is required for the shot. And as I go through these buttons, I'm only going to show you the button once, and then I'll be using the hotkeys from there on. And I strongly encourage you to do so because SYNTHEYES has some of the best default hotkeys of any software I've used. So to get started, let's go ahead and click the magic wand. And now that I've checked that off, wherever I left click, you could see that I am now placing a tracker. But how do you get these to track? You could hit the spacebar on your keyboard or come down to the arrow down here and play. So you can see that tracking is dependent on playback within SYNTHEYES. You could see that we were going a little bit fast there. I'm going to come up to View, Normal Speed, so that we can watch it at a more realistic pace. So these trackers, tracking like how I just did, doing it all at once is a pretty dirty way to do it. So I'm going to delete these and we're going to go one at a time and walk through these features. So I'm going to turn off the magic wand because if I click and drag right now, I'm going to make more trackers. I'm going to turn it off so that when I click and drag, I can highlight these points and delete with backspace. So first things first, let's put down one of the easiest points we could possibly find. So I'm going to zoom in right here, hold C to create, and then left click to make a tracker. So to quickly mention something up front about the tracker, these two boxes tend to confuse some people. The center box is the target box. All the pixels within this center box is what SYNTHEYES is actually going to track. So if this was too big and some of the reflections or background features occluded within this tracker, it's going to make your tracker pop around. So I'm going to shrink it down so I only get the details I need. The outer box is the search box, the search area. SYNTHEYES will only search within this box for this detail. So if this box was this big and we got these similar looking corners over here and here, there's a chance that SYNTHEYES will mistake these corners and the tracker might jump across to different corners. So I'm going to shrink this down to only what I need. Also, the larger that this is, the more pixels has to be searched and the slower SYNTHEYES will run. So let's bring it back down to a reasonable size and let's hit play. I'm going to pause it here before I let it continue because I want to mention that you shouldn't just let your trackers go like this. And when I mean like this, I mean you're not locked onto the tracker to carefully monitor what it's doing. So if I hit 5 on my keyboard, you could see that I've snapped and I can't pan around. But when I play, I am locked on so we can carefully see what it's doing. And you can see it did a pretty damn good job. So we're going to finalize this tracker and never touch it again. To do that, we're going to come up to the padlock up at the top. So I can click that to lock this, or I can hit plus on my number pad. So I'm going to zoom out, hit 5 on my keyboard to unlock, and let's place one more over here. C to create, adjust the size of your target box, make sure your search box is kind of reasonable, 5 to lock on, and then hit play. And we're going to lock it with plus. Now that we've covered that, let's jump into changing the tracker direction. So sometimes the best point to start tracking from, for a variety of reasons, you might want to start tracking from the middle of your shot. So if I come up to here, hold C to create a tracker, and you'll notice that we have this blue bar only facing in one direction. So when I hit let's hit 5 to lock on first. Let's hit spacebar to track. And now that we've done that, you'll notice that we can't hit play to track at the beginning. We have to tell the tracker to point the other way and, do its thing. So we're going to come over to the left and you can see this arrow right here. This is the tracker direction. This arrow is different than the arrow down below. This arrow is just your playback direction when you actually hit play. But this arrow is the tracker itself, which way it's going to be allowed to track. So I'm going to click that, and you'll see that it actually swapped our playback as well. So when I hit play, there we have it. So let's lock that with plus, and let's do it again, but with the hotkey. So I'm going to hold C, create, and we're going to hit play the track. And I'm going to jump over to that keyframe there, that little tick, our starting frame. I'm going to hit F, because F lets you jump between keys, and we'll talk more about that later. I'm going to hit Shift R to reverse the tracker direction. Play, and plus button to lock. Now let's move on to what happens when a tracker is going to be occluded by a foreground element. So let's go down to a corner like this. So if I hold C to create a tracker, scale our stuff as needed, 5 to lock on, and hit play, we're going to notice this bar comes along and causes the tracker to jump around. It eventually finds itself, but this here is going to introduce error into our camera solve and cause a massive pop or jitter. So we want to disable it once this thing passes and re-enable it once it reappears. So just before the tracker starts to get occluded and starts popping around, or sorry, on the frame that it gets occluded and starts to pop, I'm going to disable it with the switch right here. Or you can hit the hotkey E. E is enable and disable. So I'm going to hit E. So you notice that our tracker just kind of stops dead here. So I'm going to go ahead, and you can see that the search box actually lingers around for a few frames, and it'll stop eventually. But if it so happens to still be around, and the feature is within the search box, you can hit E to enable, and the tracker will find its detail again. And then you can keep tracking. By the way, you'll notice I did that very slowly rather than hitting play. To frame by frame in SYNTHEYES, use S and D for forward and back. Don't use the arrow keys. If you use S and D, you're keeping your left hand within all the hotkey territory. So now that this tracker is done, let's lock it with plus. So let's do that one more time. So I'm going to hold C, create a tracker right here, spacebar, and I could go slowly with frame by frame, S and D, until it starts to fail. And I'm going to hit E to disable, and hit E to bring it back, and continue tracking. Perfect. Lock with plus. So the next thing that I want to talk about is offset tracking. Offset tracking is, let's say a tracker is being obstructed, but for some reason the client or whoever wants that tracker to last, or maybe you need it to last. So I'm just searching around for a good detail to track for this. I might just end up tracking the same details there if I don't find something. Yeah, so we're gonna just get rid of one of these points and retrack it, but use offset tracking to make it last behind the bar. Alright, so I'm going to hold C to create a tracker, and I'm going to hit spacebar, also 5 to lock on. So I'm going to go frame by frame. So here's where the tracker starts to get cut off again. So to offset track, here's what we're going to do. We're going to pick our last favorite frame and come off to the left and hit this button offset. So when I click that, we get a crosshair that we can manipulate, and if we hold shift, we can move this target box away and track something nearby while the actual point lingers behind. So now that I've moved that up with shift, I can keep tracking until this feature returns, and then I can turn this off. If when I turn this off, this target box will snap down to the bottom. But before I snap this back to where it should be, if we look at this crosshair, it was on the corner, but then it drifted upwards a little bit. That's because if your camera rotates around, or if you're tracking offset points at different depths compared to where your actual tracker is located, you're going to have a little bit of a slide here. But I can grab this crosshair, bring it down a little bit, and it is now interpolating between this little keyed area and this little keyed area. And I can also turn off my offset now. Let's go ahead one frame, and then I'll turn it off, and we can continue tracking. And that is offset tracking. Lock with plus. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is keyframes. Now this is very important, and depending on what shot you're following along with, if you're even following along, you might have come across problems that maybe makes you wish I taught this earlier, but it's kind of a tougher thing to grasp for some people, so I just wanted to save it till the end here and give it a little bit more of a talk. So keyframing your tracker. If you'll notice, every time that we've made a tracker, I'll hold C to create, it always starts out with a little black tick at the bottom. And let's say this, if you move your tracker or adjust it, you could see it creates another tick. So the purpose of those ticks is it's actually refreshing the pattern of pixels on that frame, and then going forward, SYNTHEYES is tracking to that pattern of pixels at that time. What that means is if we track something like, let's say this big flat image here, I'll put the tracker to on that little corner, and if I just hit play and let it run through, you could see that the tracker eventually just started popping off by itself. The reason being is that if we look at this frame where that tick is, look at the pattern of pixels up in this viewer window. When I scrub, look at how the perspective changes. That pattern of pixels is now, according to SYNTHEYES, an entirely different image, and it doesn't know what to do with it. So as the perspective changes, we kind of want to tell SYNTHEYES to refresh the pattern it is looking at. So as I go, what we can do is we can come over and click Key Now, or we can hit 0 on our number pad. You can see now we have a new tick at the bottom, and when I track to the end, yes, it looks like it succeeded. It gets a little jittery, so just before the end, I'm going to make another key with 0, hit play, and it's a little bit cleaner. So now let's Shift R and track in the other direction, hit play. So it's a little bit jittery here where the perspective changes. So I'm going to place a key somewhere over here before it gets jittery, hit play. There we go, a lot cleaner. So I'm going to lock and hit scrub through, and we got a decent tracker. There's a little bit of slide there, but I'm not going to worry about that. That slide, I'm going to show another little trick with offset. So this point right here, if I put a tracker on this mark, scale it to whatever I'm comfortable with, and lock on, reverse tracking direction, so we're tracking forwards, I'm going to hit play and let's watch this tracker fail. Whoa, that shouldn't have failed that bad. Let's place another tracker, C to create, let's shrink it down, hit play. And you can see, yes, there we go. So again, our dot is changing in size, the noise is kind of screwing it up a little bit, and the lighting may be changing a little bit with the vignette as well. So as we go, let's go to the worst part of the tracker and place a keyframe with 0 on the number pad, track ahead a little bit, and see how far it goes. In this case, it looks like it went to the end just with one key. So with that, how do we fix the slide? I'm going to show you one thing that is very helpful in many cases, but it's not going to be the fix for this tracker. But if you use the arrow keys on your number pad, like 4, 8, 6, and 2, you can nudge your tracker around, hit track, and oh, well, that was a bad thing. You can nudge your tracker with the arrow keys and keep making sure that it is centered on that dot as you go. And when you're nudging, if you think that it's going too fast, hold Control and you will reduce its speed. So I can just run through this, make sure that it's sticking to the center of this dirt, And you'll notice every time I nudge or reposition, it places a key for you, which is very handy. Because when you reposition, you want that new position to be the pattern that SYNTHEYES looks for. One more little tidbit that I want to mention, that if your detail is still hanging around but you want to track it, you can re-enable your tracker or click in this window to drag it in, or you can hold Z on your keyboard to Z drop your tracker back onto place. And it'll bring your same tracker back if you hold Z. So I'll go ahead a frame, hold Z, click, and go back a couple frames with S and D just to make sure that we're on the same spot. And nudge it if you need to. And it's not worth it at this point. So that's one way you could do this. I'm going to delete that and show you the other way. So C to create a tracker, hit play, and just before it starts to screw up, we're going to place a keyframe. And there we go, done. So it has a very gradual drift. So another thing we can do with offset tracking is correct subtle movements like that. So I'm going to go over, click offset, and instead of moving this to offset around, I'm actually just going to adjust this crosshair. So it's keyed on the first frame. Oh, by the way, if you want to see the keyframes for this alone, hit E for editable offset, and now we are just looking at this actual point. So when I hit play and go straight to the very end, I can drag it back down to the center of this dot, and now when I scrub back, you can see that we've made it nice and clean throughout. And I can turn off editable offset, just see what we did there, and lock. Make sure you turn off editable offset, otherwise with other trackers, you're not going to be able to nudge and you can't drag your tracker around like this. So remember that if you realize something happened and wow, what did happen. I'm going to delete that point. So at this point, I'm just going to gun through a few trackers and go through my thought process for what I'm tracking and why I'm tracking it. So when you're tracking, always make sure you cover your foreground, midground, and as much background as you can. So for now, let's populate some points on the ground. So I'm going to place a tracker here. Always find the most contrasted details you can. So I'm going to go frame by frame and monitor this. And I'm nudging it as I go to keep centered on this white dot, which is also creating a keyframe to keep that pattern refreshed. And lock with plus. And we'll go through the same with this point. A shot like this, where we push from the foreground to the background, or in the other way around, I like to start in the middle because it's the most average portion of the shot where the deformations aren't so extreme if I track this way. And if I jump back to this keyframe, by the way, A and F jumps between your keys, and then Shift R to reverse. There, you can see the distortion is not so bad, so it made it very easy, clean point. So C to create, spacebar. I'm going to go A to jump, or sorry, F to jump to those keys, Shift R, and track. Okay, so I'm going to pretend that you know your hotkeys for now, and I'm not going to talk about them for a little while. So, always make sure you know what the scope of work for your project is, so you know where to put the most care for your trackers. Generally, you want to put trackers everywhere, because they're all going to have a ripple effect and improve one another and just help your overall solve. But sometimes, if you don't know the scope of work, you start putting down a lot of points, but you forget the important details that actually needed the most attention. So make sure you understand what is going on before you go into this. Like, let's say for this, there's CG characters sitting on these benches, and they need to appear in the reflection. So they're going to want some geometry for these windows, and that geometry is going to want to stick very nicely. Whoop, we had a pop there. So I'm going to go wherever that pop was, place a key just before, and continue on. Also, when you're dealing with structures that have very clear perspective lines, very easy details to track, always populate it and make as much use of it as you can. It's going to help you with modeling and scene orientation later on, also with stuff like distortion. So again, that'll pop here, so each time before it pops, I'm just placing a keyframe to refresh that pattern. Lock with plus. And I could spend all day adding more and more trackers to this wall, but for the sake of saving time, I'm just going to track a couple more quick ones and then move on. Sometimes when I play, I like to just spam the 0 key and place a keyframe once in a while. Lock with plus. If you wanted to do that automatically, which I don't personally recommend, you can create a tracker, come over to key now, and you'll notice there's a number here where you can tell it how many frames you want it to place within. So when I hit play, it's automatically placing keys and refreshing as it goes. Which at times could be a good thing, but sometimes if there's a light shift or something, your tracker's going to drift and then it's going to keep making a key as it drifts, and SYNTHEYES will then be okay with it. So I'm going to lock this, it's good. And on my next tracker, I'm going to zero out this value because I don't want to keep auto keying. So I'm going to right click. Right clicking in SYNTHEYES will clear any value or spinner, which is a very handy thing to remember. So let's monitor this point, nudge it as we need, and lock with plus. So let's pretend that let's put a couple more points over here. Always make sure that you don't just put one tracker in an area by itself. Always make sure that your trackers have buddies nearby. Because again, those points are going to work off of one another and help produce a better calculation. And the more trackers that you have grouped together, if any of them pop and you didn't realize, having more trackers is going to average the motion in that area. Let's track a point right here. So when the leaves come over, I'm going to hit E to disable and hold Z to bring back that same tracker. And also I want to make sure I landed it perfectly on the same detail. So if I go back, it's kind of hard to tell like this. So I'm going to go over here, hit 0 on my keyboard, and now I can hit A and F to swap between these two keyframes. And I can compare if I landed it on the same spot. Looks like on my new frame, I've got to nudge it down slightly. So I held Control and nudge to nudge it down slowly. And let's keep tracking. Lock. So now that we've done that, let's call our midground done just for the sake of time. Let's get a couple more foreground points. Lock. Lock. Having enough ground points is likely the most important thing to have in your scene, because the majority of the time you have animated characters walking across your floor, so you need your shadows and their feet to stick, so you need enough detail for modeling your plane or your surface. Also, maybe there's CG rain. That rain's gonna want to hit the ground and whatever surfaces that you have in your scene. Generally, making sure that your ground is the most populated with points is usually the safest bet, if you're wondering where you should be focusing your time. So let's pretend that we are done with the foreground. So let's look at some background points. Let's get the building over here. So let's track maybe this corner. And it looks like we picked an amazing point because it remains the entire shot. And it looks like I can track this as well because it doesn't go off screen by the looks of it. Lock. I could try to track something like this. It's kind of, thin lines are kind of finicky because they're kind of these sharp jagged edges, but it looks like this one went like a dream. And let's try to get something at the bottom here. Whoop. So here you could see we have similar looking features, and the search box jumped the cross and found another cross, and then it found another cross that looks even more similar because the search box kept yeah. So let's come back here just before it screws up. Shrink down the search box and then keep going from there. I'm also going to place a key, just refresh it as I go. And lock. You would probably like to spend more time putting as many trackers on this as you can, but I'm going to call that my background for now. Let's look at something like this over here. C to create a tracker. And let's see what the branches do to this. Oh, so you can see the branches were thin enough that they had no effect on this point. But let's see what the beginning does here, because this looks a little bit more messy. So there's some minor pops going on here. So I might as well see if I can extend this a bit. Let's go offset, hold shift, and find the closest unobstructed feature. Let's go over here maybe. There we go. And I'm just going to hit lock. There's a little bit of drift in this tracker because it looks like the reflection introduces some motion that we don't want. But that's not too bad for now. I'm going to leave it. But spend more time and adjust those if you can. Here's a background point I missed. And I'm going to turn on offset, hold shift, drag it up here. There we go. So lock. Perfect. Last thing I'm going to track before I stop this now is just this sign here. Let's say in the scope of work they wanted the glass for the reflections of animated characters on the benches, and here's where you would want to put some points on the benches so you can model them out. Put some more than I did, but you know, this is just for thought, food for thought. So they want to put something on the sign. So I'm going to track a few points on the sign. Whoops. So it pops, so I'm going to go and nudge it back into place. Looks like my tracker was just big enough that it caught the big highlight of this metal bar, or metal frame. There we go. We could try get one more over here. Shift R. There's a little bit of drift here. So I'm gonna, while my tracker direction is facing this way, I'm gonna turn on offset and E. So now I'm gonna go, my tracker direction and my playback direction are going in different ways. So I'm gonna flip this one so I can play in the same direction. And nudge that up a little bit to fix that drift. And it's not perfect, but it's okay. Again, spend more time on that if you can. The more points that you have in this area could also correct that for you. Whoop, this point was kind of drifting for me the whole time. I'm going to restart that, but I'm going to go slower. Also, I realized I can't nudge right now. So that's kind of why it screwed up on me. And I couldn't nudge because E, editable offset, was still turned on. So now I can nudge it, keep this point centered, and the pattern was refreshing, and now our tracker is golden. Let's track this little black tick here. Perfect, let's pretend that's all we need. So we have tracked our background, our midground, and our foreground. Ideally, just so you know, here's how many points you would likely want on a shot like this. The reason that we are putting so many points is because the more points that you have, the easier it is for SYNTHEYES to calculate an accurate distortion. Too many people are told at the beginning that you put a tracker in that area, you don't need any more. That is some of the biggest BS I've ever heard, and it is constantly being taught in schools. Don't listen to that. Put as many points as you can. And if you happen to be good at it, you can use auto trackers and populate your scene with a lot of trackers at once, which will greatly help your distortion. The building up here would be a very tough thing to track, but I would still populate that. I would also try to get some stuff on this rail here. Also on this little elevated thing, because maybe your characters are walking past here and they gotta cast a little shadow or something. Get the corner of it if you can. Get this bit of railing here at the end. So I'm going to hit Control A and then lock with plus. So typically this is kind of around the amount of points I might be comfortable with on a shot like this. So while I'm undoing this, I just want to say that is it for basic 2D tracking, and hopefully you learned a lot, and yeah, happy tracking.